buildings by themselves are white elephants. It's the people that run them. It's the people that bring them life, that create the circumstances that interesting businesses or individuals want to reside, whether they want to live there or work there. In a sense, you're providing an environment to people. And if you have a lot of imagination and if you're user-friendly in the way you do that, you'll have success.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, your book club discussion times 10. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like you to join me as I take a deep dive into the world of literature. In this episode, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Francis Greenburger. Francis is the founder and CEO of Time Equities, Inc., a multi-billion-dollar real estate investment and development company, as well as chairman of Sanford J. Greenburger Associates, a literary agency representing some of the most successful writers of our time. He is the founder of two important not-for-profit organizations, the OMI International Arts Center and the Greenburger Center for Social and Criminal Justice. He has served on the boards of over 15 nonprofit organizations for the arts, education, and criminal justice reform. Greenburger is also an active tennis player and skier, political cheerleader, and loving father of 4 children, each taking their unique journeys through life. I hope you enjoy our conversation. I'm here with Francis Greenburger, and I'm very excited to speak with him about his memoir, Risk Game, Self-Portrait of an Entrepreneur, published in September of 2016 by Ben Bella. Francis, you talk about how your career took off when you discovered an unmet need for one-room offices for small businesses in New York City. And you advise your reader that coming up with something like that would be a good way to generate business ideas. Do you have any other examples of that in your life or career where something wasn't available for yourself and you decided the best thing to do was to create it?
Well, in this case, it's not a business. It's a not-for-profit venture.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened to me was, again, as a consumer, I experienced the lack of availability of something that was important to me, and that's what led me on a journey which I'm sort of halfway along on in the criminal justice and mental health field. In regards to my son, when he was charged with some crimes that related to his mental health difficulties, I tried to access a mental health facility that the judicial system would consider as an alternative to incarceration, some place where he could be treated and made better rather than jail, where everybody knows that people with mental health, in particular mental illness, get worse. They don't get better. And it's funny, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a very highly respected person in the mental health field, and I said to him, would it be better if my son went to prison for a period of time? Would that straighten him out? And he said to me, no. And I said, well, why do you say that? And he said, because we know that sending mentally ill people to prison makes them worse, and when they get out of prison, as do 98% of all people, that's worse for society than if they had been treated and made better during their period of secure incarceration or the equivalent. And that eventually led me to coming to understand that America had closed all of its mental health hospitals, and we now have less than 3% of the hospital rooms we had in the 50s.
Wow.
And basically we transferred about 1 million people from our mental health system to jail. I mean, that's what happened. In the 1950s, we had 550,000 mental health beds in America. Population's doubled, so we should need 1.1 million today. We have 35,000. And if you go to the prison population, we know that roughly 50% of the 2.3 million people incarcerated are mentally ill. We took them out of the hospitals and we put them into jail. And then when they get released, of course, they're worse than when they went in, which is part of the reason we have such high recidivism rates, et cetera, and atrocities that are committed sometimes by mentally ill people after long, often abusive periods of incarceration. So this led me to understand that there was something missing, and I'm now on a quest to try to create a pilot of what's missing and come up with a demonstration project which ultimately might show government officials that there's a better way.
And would that involve some sort of a hybrid between what existed in the past and what exists now, or how would that work?
Yes. Basically, it would be a secure facility where people would voluntarily commit to 2 years of treatment, and if they didn't like it in the facility, their only recourse would be to be returned to the criminal justice system and basically to go to jail. So it's their choice. They're not there. It's not a forced something that's forced upon them. And you know, America is where it is out of what initially was a good impulse, but ultimately didn't solve what it set out to solve. It was thought that the mental hospitals of the 1950s were not working, and they weren't, and that people could be treated in community-based facilities, and with the advent of pharmacological drugs, that it would be easier to manage them. And that turned out to be true in about 50% of the cases. But the other 50%, it's not. And those are the people that, after being let go from the hospitals and being on the streets, have ended up in our jails.
Yeah, and that whole part of the book where you devote to your son and criminal justice reform, I was really poignant and really well written and really interesting, and it really made me think a lot. You know, my dad is a public defender, and we have family conversations about criminal justice reform a lot. And there was one sentence in particular that really resonated. Was, and I think it was when you were visiting your son at Rikers, you wrote, "We don't just imprison people; we imprison their whole family." Can you explain that phrase and how you think that really helps to exacerbate the issues that we have?
Well, Rikers is the New York City main jail complex, and it's on an island, and it's difficult to access, and because of the way it's arranged, everybody has to get on a public bus. You can't drive there, park there, and go in. You have to go to a remote parking lot and then get a public bus, and then you ride with everybody else who's going to Rikers. So that gave me a chance to interact and understand who else were visiting people in prison. And what was immediately apparent was that 95% of the adults were women, mothers, often accompanied by their children, and they were going to visit their children's fathers who were incarcerated. There might have been some cases in which there were fathers going to visit mothers who were incarcerated, but 95% of the visitors were women and children. And that's when I understood that this was generational effect, because these kids go to prison and that becomes part of their norm. And it's particularly tragic. The circumstances of Rikers Island in New York have been written about and are under extensive scrutiny at the moment. It is a model of what our prison system should not be. But as an example, in the visit area there's no place to interact with a child. There's no place to sit down on a carpet and maybe have some toys or something of that sort. So basically these kids go for visit time. They sit at a uncomfortable table.
For hours, probably.
For hours,
Yeah.
and that's where they interact with their father or mother, as the case may be. If you go to state prison, they have a more humane model, which is that there's an area with exactly that, a few toys, a place that parents can go and interact as one often does with small children and relate to them on their own terms. Anyway, that's where I began to understand the effects on family of incarceration. And of course, if you look at incarceration rates, it becomes clear that children of incarcerated parents have a far higher rate of incarceration than children of non-incarcerated parents. So there is this sort of residual effect.
It gets passed down generationally.
Yes,
Yeah.
that informs future generations.
Yeah. And so I want to, circle back a bit and talk about your family, since that was obviously such a key part of the whole book. Way back when you at the beginning of the book, you wrote your mother told you point blank, never have children. And it's clear throughout the entirety of the book that you not only do you have children, but you love your children. You have you have families with children, and so I was just curious about that dichotomy, and I wanted to hear how it felt to hear that from your mom, and then how it felt once you realized that children were going to be a part of your life and that you do enjoy them.
Well, of course, that statement that she made was at a moment of exasperation. I'm not sure what I was doing, or it might not have been about me. It might have related to my brother, who was a very difficult young person. But it did I did hear it, and it did resonate with me in future years, and I think in a certain sense perhaps created a little bit of distance between my mother and myself. And over time, I've come to appreciate and understand many of her outstanding other qualities, but that does continue to ring in my ears. So clearly, often we learn lessons from parents and from siblings, and we either adopt them or we do the opposite. So in my case, I chose to do the opposite. And, I feel that one of the important things about being a parent, or most important things, is to build self-confidence in the child.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the child is confident, whatever their potential is, whether it's creative, artistic, sports, they'll approach it in a different way than if they lack confidence. And, how do you build confidence? Partially it's through love, partially it's through respect, and partially it's through encouragement of specific achievements that children have.
Okay. I want to also talk about how you talk about school and schooling and your encounters with the education system as you grew up. You definitely had all sorts of issues with it, and at one point you decide to just drop out of high school. You're in the midst of sort of all sorts of other business endeavors, and it really sounded like somewhat of a familiar story that we've heard from many different people about entrepreneurs dropping out of school at whatever level they're at, from Zuckerberg to Gates and those types of people. So I was curious about, your mindset as you made that decision. And then kind of following up, though, you talk later in the book that you did end up going back and getting a formal education and getting your GED and getting a college degree. And so I was wondering both why you dropped out and then why you decided to come back and get that degree later.
Well, my particular story, which I tell in the book, is that I was in one of New York City's specialized high schools. It was one of 3 or 4 high schools for high achievers. The school I was in was particularly focused on high mathematic achievers, Stuyvesant High School. But I found that there was an enormous amount of homework expected, and that together with things that I was trying to achieve in my after-school life, run businesses, I also had a very active social life. It wasn't working, and effectively I went into a sort of default mode at school, just didn't do my homework, and was doing poorly on tests, and finally I walked into the guidance office and said to my counselor, "Look, I don't really think I belong here. I'm in love. I'm about to move in with my girlfriend, and I'm busy running these businesses, and I don't have time for what you have going on." And I expected her, of course, to throw me out on my ear, but she actually listened sympathetically and said, "Perhaps you don't belong here." And that's when I decided that it was okay for me to drop out of this otherwise school with an extraordinary reputation. And it was always in my mind that I would somehow go to finish up at night or something, and that's ultimately what I did. I went to it wasn't a GED. I went to an actual evening high school in New York, Washington Irving Evening High School, which I chose because it was geographically proximate to where my office was. And then I went to Baruch College again at night, again because it was proximate to where I was working and living. But I ended up getting an excellent education at both of those places and hold them in very high regard, now later in adulthood.
Oh, well, that's great. I go to Baruch often actually to play racquetball, randomly enough. They have excellent racquetball courts for those of you in New York.
Well, I lecture there often in their real estate school, and I'm on their real estate school has a separate board, and I'm as active as I can be to support them because I think it's a great institution, and I think public education is one of the extraordinary, particularly higher education, one of the extraordinary benefits of living in a place like New York, and we have really fantastic public colleges.
We definitely do. So to kind of flip back to real estate, some of your earlier properties, and you talk about this a lot when you were talking about what you did in the 80s, were in undesirable neighborhoods, as you put it. And you even had hired people from the Nation of Islam to try and impose some order. And I guess what I was curious about, and I think someone reading this book might be curious about, is sort of the difference in mindset here between somebody that's looking to purchase real estate to invest versus someone that's looking to purchase real estate to live in, and how those differences were able to manifest themselves in terms of how New York City was rebuilt in terms of the real estate.
Well, I think I think they're two very, very different um, thought patterns. Obviously, when you're looking for something for yourself, you have a wide variety of criteria that you want to apply. You're looking for certain characteristics in the location, whether it's certain qualities of quality of life issues or proximity to work, to schools, to family, type of building that you like to be in, small building, big building, private house. It's all very much from a personal perspective, and of course it's driven by budget. When you're an investor, I think what you're looking to achieve is obviously a combination of financial gain, but also doing something that is productive and positive for community or society. For instance, in this particular case, this was an area that was actually not too far from a place I had lived, but as New York often changes from block to block, it was a very different block than where I lived.
Mm-hmm.
And it was characterized by being very run down and having a very difficult population. And these buildings had been neglected and run down, and some bank had foreclosed on them, and they didn't want to own them for 24 hours. And in fact, the requirement of the purchase was they were selling them at a very low price, but you just had to go there, sign the papers, and take it over because they didn't want to have the risk of something bad happening in the buildings under their ownership.
Mm-hmm.
So what I saw as an entrepreneur was a very low entry point, which, among other things, at that point in my career, I couldn't afford anything but low entry points. And I knew that the location, even though it was different from where I lived, was not that far away and had the proximity for positive change. New York and the Upper West Side, where this was in the process of gentrification. So more young people were coming in and needed additional housing and were willing to go into riskier locations if they could get good value and a decent place to live. So my thinking was that if we went into the buildings, if we got rid of the tenants who were not abiding by normal standards, and if we fixed the buildings up, that we could attract this younger group and increase the income, because even though they wanted value, they were still willing to pay more than many of the tenants who were there, who often didn't pay any rent.
Yeah.
Generally, we could improve the situation. So I saw a chance to make a positive impact on community, and at the same time have a positive business transaction that ultimately would reward me financially.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and it's always nice when you can get kind of a win-win scenario like that.
Right. I personally I would not engage in something that wasn't a win-win scenario.
Yeah.
I don't want to make money doing something that's negative. It's not who I am.
Yeah. Well, that's great to hear, and I'm sure a lot of people appreciate that, because there are people who are like that.
There are other people who have different points of view.
Yeah, fair enough. The other story that I really enjoyed was the Clinton Hill Co-op conversion story, because I lived in the Clinton Hill Co-ops my first year in New York in 2014. So it was great to hear the story of how it all came to be. So, just quickly, maybe if you could recap the story for people. And there was one particular thing I wanted to ask about, which was when you were trying to find financing, and you went from bank to bank to bank, and I think that your grit there was really admirable. So maybe just quickly tell the story, and then talk about how perseverance played an important role in that transaction.
Well, as you know, since you lived there, this was a very large housing complex, 13 buildings, 1,200 apartments, located in an area that in the early 1950s, it was near the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and it had been built as housing for, I think, officers and servicemen who were part of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and of course anybody else. It had the demographics had changed, and over the years it had gotten into had run down. It was subject to the same rent control laws that affected a lot of New York City, and owners were short of money to maintain buildings. And it was owned by a man, had been owned really since the 50s till I met him in the late 70s, early 80s, by a guy who was very responsible, and he had bought this with a syndicate of investors. They had about 800 investors because it was such a large property. And he was aging, and he had struggled to try to make the financial aspects of the complex work, but because of rent regulations, it was making less and less money. He was in default of his mortgage because he couldn't pay his mortgage, and he didn't know what to do. And he was at that point afraid that he might pass away, and he would leave this to his wife to deal with, which was just something he couldn't tolerate. So he was very open to making any kind of a transaction that he could. And I went there and realized that even though the buildings needed work, needed improvements, and even though the demographics had changed, it had become a desirable place for middle-class African-American families to live. And for them, it was a step up from some of the poorer neighborhoods. And I thought that they might be interested in buying their apartments and entering into home ownership, which many of them had not experienced. And that could then, as part of the equation, bring not only economic reward for me, but provide the money that was needed to improve the buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And that was basically my business plan. And at first I took an option on the property from the owner. He said, there were no buyers for somebody who would just buy it from him. So he was willing to give a 2-year option, and then I could negotiate with tenants and try to put my business plan together, which, given that I was extremely capital constrained, was a good way. But he had an out in the contract, which if somebody came along with actual money, he could tell me that I had to buy then, or he could cancel my contract. And after about a year, when I was busy trying to get it done, that's what happened. During that year, I had been trying to find financing for the project and had gone to many, many banks. And everybody kept saying no, no, no. And I became like a nut about it. I mean, this was pre the collapse of the savings and loan era, so there were, 3 times as many banks in the United States, or 10 times as many banks as there are today. And, I would write to all these. The banks were usually advertising for deposits, but I would write to them and say, how about financing this property? Never mind that they were in Colorado or Arkansas or wherever. And, of course, none of them went along with it. And then out of the blue, I got a call from Citibank, the head of their credit policy, who had Citibank had turned the project down early on because they were one of the obvious people to go to. But unbeknownst to me, what had happened was that they had become under scrutiny by the federal regulators, and in particular by a congressional committee that was investigating redlining.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a congressman from Queens named Rosenthal, and he was really putting the screws on him. So Citibank was desperately looking for some way to prove that they were not redlining, which of course they were. So I went, he said, look, if you still want financing, you can come and pitch me on it. So I went in to see him, and this was he was a very high official, far higher than would normally deal with a matter of this type. And he looked at me and he said, does your project have political support? Well, I had gone to the borough president of Brooklyn and the local the congressmen and the local officials, because this was going to affect an important group, it's a large group of people, and they had all said that they were in favor of it. So I could tell him honestly, I said, look, I have, and these are the people. He says, well, if I call, I think it was Howard Golden was president of Brooklyn at that time, will he tell me that this project is okay? I said, well, I met with his chief of staff. Anyway, long story short, he made the call, and next day agreed to give us the financing because he wanted to have an answer for this Congressman Rosenthal. So I guess if I hadn't gone on like a nut for this year and applied to 1 million banks, I'm not sure that would have that those efforts were the result of why he called me back, other than his wanting to solve his political problem. But I think it's certainly true in life generally that perseverance pays off. I mean, it has a different ending at the moment, but at some point I remember Hillary saying to me in some party that we were at that if she ever learned one thing from Bill, it was never, ever, ever to give up. And of course, if you think about Bill's presidency and the impeachment hearings, he was tough as stones, and it ultimately worked to his benefit. Yeah.
You mentioned the savings and loan crisis, and I remember you were talking about dealing with the repercussions of it in terms of how it affected your business. And you described that it was important for you to confront the problems as they arose and be very transparent about them. And I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with when it comes to problems and things that could affect them. How did that sort of mantra of transparency, confronting the problems, not trying to hide them under the rug, how did that help you out while dealing with the savings and loan crisis?
Well, as a result of the savings and loan crisis, banks were cutting down on lending by huge amounts. And since we were in the business of selling housing, if there's no financing for new buyers, you can't sell housing. And so the writing was on the wall once they like all shut down almost simultaneously. I decided that, I could see that our cash flow was dependent on continued sales. And there wasn't going to be any cash flow because the banks weren't financing buyers and nobody was buying. So I could see that 60 days out we were going to face a financial crisis and not be able to pay our bills. I made the decision to go to all of my banks, and we had a lot of them at the time, maybe 20 of them, and say, look, this is what's going on, and unless you plan to change your lending policies, we're not going to be able to pay you in about 60 days. And I think at the end, the banks appreciated that, People like to hear about problems before they occur. They don't like to hear about problems, but if they're going to hear about it, for a bank person who, let's say, stood up for you and said that you were a good borrower and did all the things that bankers have to do to get loans made, for them to hear that you're out of money 6 months later because you haven't paid them, that's not being responsible. Once I went to them and said, look, you have a choice here. You can either continue to make loans, at least to the people buying in the project that you already financed, so that way you won't make it your loan to me a bad loan, and so you'll have good loans because people will buy apartments and they'll pay you. I say you don't have to finance new projects, but however, that logic was not what the bank regulators wanted at that particular time or whatever. It was just a shutdown.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think people respected the fact that I was up front, and many of the banks worked with me and gave me accommodations that I think if I had approached them under other circumstances, they would not have. The proof is that there were people who did the opposite of what I did, because frankly this affected every real estate developer in New York and the United States.
Right.
It was such a broad-based crisis. And I think people who came later or after the fact or tried to pretend that things were different than they were got less cooperation than I did.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really good lesson. It's just kind of get it out in the open now.
And also, when people have a problem, they often avoid going to the source of the problem.
Hmm.
So some people, let's say in my position, would have run around, trying to borrow money from what we call hard money lenders, very high interest, just get them into more and more trouble and not really be able to deal with the problem. And so they're busy trying to fight the inevitable rather than saying, well, look, this problem is emanating from some source. There's a department store, I can't pay my bill, and rather than running to my brother and my aunt trying to borrow money they don't have or can't afford, let me go to the department store and tell that they're already involved in the problem and talk it out with them and see what accommodation can be made. So often going to the person who controls the problem rather than around them or solving them in peripheral ways is a good approach. And you can still go to your brother and your mother and whatever and try to borrow the money, but go to the person who controls the problem and make them part of the solution.
Yeah, that's great advice. And also, anyway, from what I understand of hard money lending, it's usually very short term, regardless. So you would have had to try and refi your way out of there, which would have been impossible anyway. And so it
would have been
not a solution.
Would have been a disaster.
Yeah. But I think that also speaks to something that you mentioned about the truth and putting it out there. And so you'd also talk about that a bit in terms of your family life and how hard it was for Judy to accept her cancer diagnosis, or for you to accept when a psychiatrist told you Morgan would probably be in jail, by the time he was 14. These are really hard things to hear. And it seemed like both you and Judy had a hard time accepting those particular things. And so maybe could you talk a little bit about why it's hard for us to accept sort of personal things that others see as obvious sometimes?
Well, I think that I know that there's a dynamic in human psyche called denial. And for instance, there's one of the great thinkers, psychologists in the field, I think her name was Dr. Kubler-Ross, who studied mourning. And there are 3 stages of mourning. The first is denial, then anger, and then acceptance. And what she observed is that at first people don't want to deal with a situation. So psychologically, I mean, they may by rote know the facts. Oh, somebody died, something bad happened, but they're really not open to it. Interestingly, last night I saw a new film that was out called Manchester by the Sea, which deals with this situation. Somebody's brother died of cancer, and the brother who survived became the guardian for his brother's child. And at first, the child was living in complete denial of the fact that his father died. And it was only after some period of time that he then all of a sudden went through the so-called anger phase and then eventually entered into acceptance. So I think it's a normal part of human psychology, and to some degree maybe protects us from emotional shock at the most difficult moments. I don't know whether that's the answer you were looking for, but
it was a great answer. No, it's definitely it was fine. I also wanted to talk about mentors, since you briefly brought it up at the beginning, how important mentors were to you, and how much you value them, and how much you credit a large part of your success to mentors. I think a lot of people recognize that mentors can be very helpful. I think people sometimes struggle with how to find them and how to cultivate that relationship. And so I was wondering if you had any advice for someone like that.
Well, I think that probably people are more open to mentorships than many people assume. And I think if you see somebody who you think could play that role for you, and you reach out to them, you might be surprised what doors open. I'm thinking of a friend of mine who was a young French artist who came to New York many, many years ago, I think in the 60s or 70s, and he didn't know anyone. But he was, he realized that he could learn a great deal if he met some other artists, particularly ones that were accomplished and who had established themselves. And, he just reached out to them, sent them a note, called them, knocked on their door, and he said most of the time they were willing to give him an hour, and once they had done that, sometimes friendships develop, not always. But people who are in places of success or respect often like to be appreciated, and when you reach out to somebody for advice, that's kind of an act of appreciation or a compliment that you respect the person enough to do that. And so, there's reciprocity, and it's a matter of reaching out, and of course knowing who good mentors would be. You have to turn to the right people. Here's a funny little mentor story from a context that you won't expect. My son, who's now in his close fourth year of incarceration, and will actually be released in a few months. But I recently, during a visit, and because they wrote me letters, met with a couple of people in prison that he became very close to. And I was very encouraged that these were two extraordinarily positive people, notwithstanding their incarceration. One of them was somebody who had committed a robbery. Must have been a bad one. I don't know exactly what happened. I don't think anybody was killed, but clearly it was a bad one. When he was 16 or 17 years old, and he was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. And he's been in jail for 16 or 17 years. Well, this person decided to turn his life into a positive direction. He did get his GED in prison, and later went on to complete a college degree in prison, and in fact has taken every possible improvement course available in prison. He's written me a long letter about himself and has endless awards and things that he won that he showed me evidence of. So an extraordinarily positive person, and when he gets out, which he will in 3 or 4 years, he wants to devote himself to helping other young people who might have been him when he was younger. So even in jail, there are some people who project a great deal of positiveness.
Yeah.
And I spoke with my son, and I said, I respect the fact that you turn to these people. And he said, yes, I only go to people who have positive energy for me. And, we talk all the time and share our positive thoughts, and that's how we get by. So what a great way to try to transition back into normal life.
Yeah, that's a great story. And that's really amazing to have drive like that. I mean, we talk about perseverance. To do all those things while you're incarcerated is pretty amazing. I wanted to ask you about art, because art is something that you clearly value, both from the book and just being in your office. You've got beautiful works of art adorning all of the walls, and I know you're a big collector. But I wanted to talk about Omi. And in pronouncing that right, Omi?
It's actually Omai.
Omai. So good thing I asked. Omai. But you founded an artist colony, Omai, and I really enjoyed the stories of building it and creating the space. I thought they were wonderful. I work with an arts nonprofit here in New York called The Secret City, and we're at the very, very beginning stages of really building ourselves out. And so I thought, from someone that's kind of done that whole process, I'm sure there are many other arts organizations that would be curious to know what you thought led to the successes that Omi has seen.
What the definition of opportunity is. It's when experience and luck meet. And I think that applies to Omai. I had spent 3 or 4 years volunteering at another residency program and observed many things about it that I didn't think worked very well. So I had that experience when I began to think about creating one that was better than where I had first encountered residency programs. I also had advice from people who had attended the other program of what they thought could be better, and who offered to form an initial board with me. So we went into it with a little bit, or not so little bit, of experience, and a lot of hope, and we were lucky. And somehow it all came together and ended up being a very, very successful venture, which caught the interest of the art world, which meant that we had the best and the brightest artists in the world heard about the program and wanted to participate, and once they were there, the New York art world wanted to come and experience them. So it sort of became a self-fulfilling success story. how you apply that in other contexts, I'm not sure. You know, every recipe has different ingredients.
Sure.
But I think maybe understanding needs, understanding what if it's an arts related venture, or what the needs are, and then trying to respond to them is a good step towards success.
I mean, yeah, that sounds just like what we were talking about earlier in terms of
Identifying
discovering a
need.
business. Yeah,
Yeah.
any of that. It's about thinking, what do people want that's out there? What do people really, or need is much stronger even than a want. So, yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And you also say, later on in the book, you mentioned when it comes to investments, you said you pick jockeys and not horses. And I feel like that has sort of wide-ranging implications for a lot of the stuff we've talked about. So I just was curious as to what your explanation of what that phrase means, and maybe how that ties in with some of your endeavors.
Well, I think that I'll put it in a business context, but you could really apply it in any context.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what drives successful enterprises and undertakings, whatever they are not simply ideas or but are people.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can get the right people behind a concept, an idea, an undertaking, it will succeed, or will have a much higher likelihood of success than if you don't understand the human factor in what you're doing. So in approaching my business, even though we're in the real estate business, and you might look at the 250 buildings that we own and say, well, those are your assets. I say, and I don't mean this, it's not some trite line, but the people who work at Time Equities are really my assets, because buildings by themselves are white elephants. It's the people that run them, it's the people that bring them life, that create the circumstances that interesting businesses or individuals want to reside, and whether they want to live there or work there. In a sense, you're providing an environment to people. And if you have a lot of imagination, and if you're user-friendly in the way you do that, you'll have success. And if you're not, you won't. So the context in which I described it in the book was the way I go about making investments in non-real estate things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I could pretend that, I can pick the best stocks under the sun. But I do have a full-time job, and some would say 5. And I'd be fooling myself if I thought that somehow, I could manage stocks in the way that somebody who's a real professional, who's really developed their skills, and who has a very informed point of view that I listen to and believe in, is that they're going to outperform what I would do. So that's what I do. I look for the person, and when I do stocks or fund investments, less important to me is exactly what the idea is. It's not that I want to be long, short, tall, fat, thin. I want to be convinced by the person who's going to be really making these choices for me that they have an informed, intelligent, and committed perspective.
Yeah. I think that sort of, again, loops back to execution. This is
Absolutely.
what we were talking about before. So I like to see when things like that tie in. In the epilogue, you wrote that you question all gospel, and that you're not really sure that there are answers, just points of view at a given moment of time. That really resonated with me. I love that line. Maybe you could talk about how that perspective has helped you over your career and your life.
Years ago, I co-authored another book on negotiation, and in it I said that no isn't a decision, it's a point of view at a particular point in time. So if you think about, for instance, I describe in the book how I helped an author who's now world famous, James Patterson, and submitted his book to 38 publishers. And in fact, the publisher that I sold it to, I had actually submitted the book. They were the 5th publisher that I submitted it to. They said no. And the 38th time, I happened to go back to the same publishing company, but I chose a different person. And they said yes. And that turned out to be a legendary decision, given who James Patterson is. And interestingly, he's still published, even though we don't represent him, he's still published by Little Brown. These are examples of what you asked about.
Yeah. That's a great example. So we're wrapping up, and I always like to ask at the end if there were any other lessons or takeaways or anything else that you thought you learned over the course of your life that might be helpful to people and that you wanted people to get out of this book.
Well, I guess there are two things that I've tried to that I tried to discuss in the book, and that is that people who have entrepreneurial talents should think about applying them not only in the for-profit sector, but in the not-for-profit world as well. The not-for-profit sector in the United States is a very, very big one and is very, very important to our quality of life. And we have a very interesting system here, very democratic in my mind, which is that when you donate money to a charity, which is defined, in somewhat broad terms, in essence, the government is making a contribution right along with you because they give you a tax exemption.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, 40% of whatever your tax rate is, of the money that you're giving, is really coming from the government. So talk about the ability to vote for something. That's an important way to vote for it. Well, these organizations not only need money, they need talent. They need people to make their missions happen, and they need to be managed. So it's another way that people who have success in other aspects of their life can use their talents, and it's very rewarding. It's not pure charity in the sense. I feel very rewarded by my experiences working with various not-for-profit organizations. I get a lot out of it, and feel better about myself, and feel that I make a difference and make an impact. And at the end of the day, what's important to all of us.
Mm-hmm.
One other thought that I'll share with you, which I mentioned in the book, but I don't know that I have developed it as much as I currently am thinking about it, and that's the answer to. I was recently being interviewed by in a business context. I can't quite remember, and who was interviewing me, but they asked me, "What is the one thing that you feel could endanger your company in the future?" And some of the obvious answers that would click through one's mind is global warming, high interest rates, bad projects, or whatever. And I was surprised when I answered failure to innovate. Because at the end of the day, the thing that in business is most valuable is when you have an idea or an approach or a point of view that's different than the one that most people have. Because if you're competing in a world with generic ideas, margins are very thin. Entry points are usually very high. And in a sense, risk is very high. I mean, we often think, well, if we do something that everybody else is doing that's succeeding, we're going to succeed. But that's not the case. And if you have a unique idea or unique perspective, and that it may not be that you've made a new mousetrap, it may just be that you figured out that there are more mice over there than over there. It's those unique ideas and unique perspectives that are going to distinguish you and bring you more success than if you try to compete generically.
All right, that's great. I love those last two lessons. So we'll take those away. Francis, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. That was a great interview. And I really cannot recommend enough the book, Risk Game, Self-Portrait of an Entrepreneur by Francis Greenburger. It is a fascinating, fascinating story of both his life, his career, and everything in between. So thanks again, Francis.
John, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.